to today's In Conversation with, and I'm joined by the wonderful Sylvia and Dawn, who are both ambassadors with This Can Happen. And today the conversation will be geared around infertility and what that means for different individuals, different groups, the experiences, and I'll be sharing a bit about my own personal experience. I've been on this journey for quite some time. So yeah, we'll be having a conversation and sharing our views about infertility. So I suppose kind of to kick it off, maybe sharing what it means to us. So for me, infertility is all about being gone on a process, been on a journey to be able to conceive and have a child. And there's been lots of things and bumps and barriers and challenges that have happened along the way, including going for different treatments, IVF, ectopic pregnancy. So I think when you embark on the journey, it can bring different things. And I've met lots of different people who've had different journeys as well. And for some, it's, you know, if you're not able to conceive naturally, the journey ends there. But for some others, it will continue into different forms of treatment. So what are your thoughts, Sylvia? What it means to you?
I didn't go down, didn't go as far as the infertility treatment. But we, you know, when I was married, we had various. I don't have children. Now whether me or my husband were infertile, we never found out because we just never had children. And so it got to that stage, and then our marriage broke up. But also not being able to have children was also a fundamental factor in our marriage breakup. The fact that we didn't have children, and the fact that the blame was always put on me. You know, that you haven't given me a child. We don't have children. So it was a fundamental thing in our marriage breakup. Although we never actually found out whether it was just an infertility issue or whether it just wasn't to be. So we never went as far as you down the infertility treatment route and IVF and everything else like that. But yeah, it has a lot of stigma attached to not having children, which I'm sure we'll come on to a bit later.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You touched on some really important points, but yeah, we'll come back to. So thank you. And Dawn, how about yourself?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I think for me, so I don't have children, and I think you know, there was a period when we were trying, but it just didn't happen. And actually, I think to Sylvia's point, we never really explored why it hadn't happened. But I think if I look back on it now, it also coincided with a time that I was really struggling with my own mental health, lots of stress and anxiety, and I think that links into it for me, because I know that can have a massive impact on whether somebody can conceive or not. So I kind of, you know, as much as we never followed through what the cause was, I kind of put it down to that, to be honest. So yeah, it's a really interesting topic to explore.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, and just going back to the point, Sylvia, where you talked about it was your fault, even though there's nothing to suggest it. Just wanted to explore that a little bit more, and how did that play out for you, and how did that sort of leave you feeling?
I think just to back it up even before that, there was times when I was interviewed for jobs, and believe it or not, one of the questions in an interview would be, you're a young lady, mid-20s, when are you going to have children? So as immediately there's that pressure as well. And again, a bit further down the line, when you're in an organisation, you know, going for promotion, you know, you're a mid to late 30s woman now, Sylvie, when are you going to have children? So there's that pressure as well. But taking that into the personal marriage situation, yes, it was always deemed it was my fault. I was the one who couldn't conceive. And that sort of adds an added pressure. And to Dawn's point about stress, become quite stressed about it. And it can, you know, and then when it starts to have an impact on one's marriage, more stress, more pressure. I remember my mother-in-law saying to me, well, Sylvia, if you had a child, it would make everything so much better. You know, but it was always, you know, the finger was pointing at me. And that has a huge impact on one's, you know, self-esteem, value? Am I just here to have a baby? Is that the whole point? Is that actually what I want? But is that because what he wants, his parents want? Is it actually what I want? And it causes a whole sort of conflicts and dilemma and questions going on in your own brain. And again, to your point as well, that causes more stress and more pressure. And perhaps it was me. Who knows? But perhaps that was the barrier. But it really just sort of really gives you such a hard time.
Yeah, and for what you're saying, a lot of it resonated. So for me, quite early on, I got diagnosed with endometriosis, and that was deemed the reason why. Now I think back and think, well, actually, women who have endometriosis do fall pregnant, do have babies. So is that really it? I mean, it was put down to that because it's medically that's what they would say. And with that came for me a lot of guilt, a lot of shame. It is my fault, and I carried that for so many years. Beating myself with that stick and always feeling that sense of guilt. And like you were saying, Sylvia, it really impacts your self-esteem. And it's almost like, how are people perceiving you and how am I perceiving myself in the world? Just because I haven't been able to get pregnant and have a child, does that make me any less? And it should it should not. And that shouldn't be the value placed on women, is it whether you can produce a child or not. And that, I think as women, I don't know how you feel, we sometimes take that on a lot more because we should be carrying a child, even though it's a 50-50 thing. There's, involvement in both in conceiving.
I think, and I think it's interesting because I think, apologies, that's my dog barking in the background, a very apt moment. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I think we've also touched on society, and I think you probably have an expectation on yourself, and I know I did. You think, you grow up, you meet somebody, you get married, and then the next stage is you have a baby. And I think society and the way we social media is, and even sort of media and TV, films always equate to a family with 2.4 children, don't they? So I think that's planted in your head at a very early age. And I think what we now know is that some people choose not to, and that's okay. Some people can't, and some people have to follow other areas to fulfill that that dream of having a child, whether that's adoption, fostering, or IVF. So I think, but we carry that pressure as well, don't we, as well? Because there was a point when I felt hugely guilty that I was letting people down because it hadn't happened. I think to your point, Sylvia, your mother-in-law, so in-laws, outlaws, your parents, everybody dreams of wanting to be sort of a grandparent and a granddad. And the fact that I hadn't gone down that route with my husband, there was a little bit for a while that made me feel really guilty. I've managed to put that to bed now, which is good, but there is that expectation there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose, I know, Sylvia, you also touched on, the questions you were asked in the workplace, and in this day and age, you'd be surprised if those questions came about, to be honest.
Yeah. But I was asked those very overtly. When are you going to start having a family?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, hang on, that's none of your business. At the same time, having said that, I can understand that from the employer's point of view, to make sure they've got cover and maternity cover and business continuity and all that. But at the same time, it's a personal matter. And when someone asks you that and you've got all the other pressures going on, you start to feel like, am I normal? Am I normal that I haven't got children? And then when you see, your friends, they've all got kids, or one's pregnant and one's on their second, and one's, they've just fallen pregnant, and we weren't. There's that pressure. Am I normal? And when an employer asks, when are you going to have kids? There's more pressure, and you do start to feel a bit odd, a bit out of place. I'd like to think those questions aren't asked anymore, but I really don't know.
Yeah, and it's almost like, I remember when I first got married, it's like, you're married, and the question soon after I start, so when you're having your first child, and those sorts of things. And it's like, you shouldn't, for me now, I try to get their message out there as much as possible. Just don't ask that question, when are you having a baby, because you don't know what's going on in the background. And I think when people are struggling, and it was the case for me and my husband, we didn't want anyone to know. We kept it such a secret that we're going through treatment, because it was the fear of, the shame and what people might think. And a lot of couples experience that, who are choosing to go for treatment or not, but it's like this massive stigma of like not being able to have a child. And it's not, there's no science behind it. You can't choose, say, yeah, I'm going to have a child, and it's going to happen tomorrow, because it doesn't work like that. But yeah, like in the workplace, luckily, I mean, fortunate, I've not been asked, I don't think, from memory, those kinds of questions. But again, it's both twofold. Women that are planning to get pregnant and start pregnancy hide it, because they don't want to feel like the employer overlook them for promotion or feel like they're not fit for the job. But then the other side is you're going through treatment as well, and it's a stigma attached to that. So it just becomes quite difficult. But what I did quite early on, a nurse gave me some good advice that, try to be open with your employer, because when you're trying to hide it, you've got to go for all these appointments, and it just becomes even more stressful. So I was quite open about it, and it allowed me to do what I need to do. And companies, far and few between, have fertility policies. I'm lucky where I work now, they do actually have one where they recognise it's, something that you're going through, and that you might allocate a number of days leave to go for your appointments, treatment, etc., which is great. But just coming back to you, Dawn, what was your experience in the workplace, if any, and was it positive, was it negative?
Yeah, I mean, when I first got married, sort of for the first probably 5 years, to be honest, I think, as I said a minute ago, I think your friends are going, oh, the next step must be, you must want to have children. That must be the next step. And I think if it happened, I was always going to be an older mum anyway. And I think that was probably a conscious decision that I've made, because at that point my career was starting to take off. So it was never going to be as soon as we got married. But and it is hard. It is hard. I think, to your point, Sylvia, you do see people with children, and you do, that does absolutely tug at the heartstrings, because you think, oh, actually, maybe now is the time. But then, at the time I was wanting to sort of pursue my career, and then once I'd done that, it did get to a point when we kind of tried, and it just didn't happen. And I think I'm a great, this may be the wrong way to look at things. I'm a great believer in fate, and things happening for a reason. And I guess, we then decided to kind of stop and be happy with what we had. And I appreciate that doesn't work for everybody, but that the expectation was huge, and people asking is uncomfortable. And, I think in particular family, that's really uncomfortable, because I think, as I said a minute ago, you kind of feel like you're letting people down. Which can be quite difficult. So to try and make a joke of it, but then it really resonates deep down, doesn't it? It's or maybe one day, but it really hits and lands hard. So, but I didn't have lots of it in the workplace, if I'm honest.
I think also it's a very personal thing. It's very intimate. It's a very personal thing. And if someone is going through a tough time, do they really have to explain? Or should they be asked to explain, that they're going through treatment? That's another thing that sort of irks me sometimes. It's a very private, very intimate thing. And to be asked all those, when is your next appointment? When are you going to be in? How are you getting on? Sometimes without any malintent. But if things aren't going quite so well, it can be very intrusive and very upsetting, to hear those questions and perhaps sort of think that people may be talking behind our backs. And I think also, let's remember, this is not just about the ladies, it's about the guys as well. I remember working in an environment, it's a quasi-trading environment many years back, and there was a young lad there. It was obvious he and his wife were trying, and the other lad really used to like pull his leg about, and you can imagine the banter that went on. And I used to think, oh, poor soul, this is a private thing, does him and his wife really aware that they're having this conversation in the workplace about it? And equally, if it is his the wife or the female partner that is struggling, how does that person then manage that when they're going through that? Yeah, I think there's a lot of sort of sensitivity and some more compassion and empathy and kindness around this. And sometimes let's not be as intrusive. It's great to talk about it. But let's just remember it's a very private thing. From what you've gone through, Anita, it's a huge. It's intrusive. It's invasive. Should you have to explain what's going on to people in the workplace? In my position, I don't think so.
And it is that thing where, like you say, it is very personal. But I think if you feel yourself wanting to ask that question, ask yourself, why do you have the right to ask that question? Because no one has the right to ask that question unless somebody themselves divulges what might be going on, or where they're at. You don't have the right to ask that question.
And just on that, Anita, did you? I know you said you didn't get asked too many questions in your workplace, but did you ever have situations where you were being asked very directly and you had to sort of try and field those questions?
No, I mean, I can't remember anyone kind of trying to get that information from me. But what's interesting at work or wherever, over the years, when people are like, oh, you're married, oh, how long have you been married for? And when you tell them how long you've been married for, straight away, in their brain, they're computing, oh, you've been married that long, where's the baby, kind of thing. Because that's the next question that follows is, oh, do you have any kids? No. And then that there's stuff going on in their brain, but they're not necessarily asking, but you just know what they're thinking. And to be really honest, there's been moments where I've actually lied and said I've been married a lot shorter time because I just didn't want that question or to deal with it, which is horrendous actually when I think about it, and it shouldn't come to that. So that's where I think people need to be really aware of asking or those sort of questions about children and if they have any or what's happened.
Okay, again, to your point there, Anita, when people say, you're married, or even now, you got any kids? And then you get, oh, something wrong. Oh, you okay? And it's almost like that, almost like a pitying. I think, as you say, it's not really any of their business, but at the same time, you can almost feel the vibes of what's going on. And a great point that you made, Dawn, earlier, it may be someone's choice not to have children, not to assume that there is a challenge or infertility going on. It's someone's choice perhaps sometimes not to have children. But to your point there, Anita, that sometimes, yeah, I've got a couple, just to keep them quiet.
It's really sad that we do that just to fend off some of the questions or almost protect ourselves from that as well.
I agree. I think it's interesting as well when you think about how the males deal with it, and actually it's just reminded me of a conversation I had with somebody in my team a few years back actually. So they were looking to foster, and I hadn't quite appreciated that the checks that they do for people that want to foster are like massively in depth, which you would totally understand why. And I think my friend made a comment to me actually that her other half was really struggling because everybody wanted to know how she was, everybody wanted to know how she was feeling, and he was part of that equation too. And I think we do sometimes forget that, don't we? Because you think that the female takes it all on, but actually the other half and the male feels it as well, don't they? Absolutely feels it, and they're probably going through more because they can't fully understand how we feel in that situation.
Yeah, and just kind of to share the kind of things that my husband would say is he was kind of watching from the sidelines. He felt helpless because it was me doing I had a few operations for my endometriosis and then doing the injecting and extraction and all of that stuff. And I would always say, it's not just me, you're half of this journey as well. So don't forget about yourself in it, taking care of yourself, your mental health. But I think the thing that we didn't appreciate, and I definitely didn't, is the impact on the mental health as you're going through that journey. But even just at the start of it, the fact that you're taking that path or having to take that path because things haven't happened as they should, and then, you know, going through treatments. And when I think about it, in 1 year, no, in space of 10 months, I had an operation for my endometriosis, a round of IVF, which was that an ectopic, which was another operation. And then a few months later, I did another round of IVF. Like, what planet was I on to put myself through so much? And I think I see loads of other women, they just keep going, and they kind of lose themselves. And I did that. I lost myself. And just from the ectopic, it was the onset of PTSD. And that kicked off a lot of things. I mean, all the way through it, with anxiety, depression, and it had such an impact. And after the third round of IVF being unsuccessful, we were just like, okay, we need to stop and just live, because we'd stopped living. And then, you know, all the way through, I was doing, you know, on and off, like counselling and alternative therapies. Everything was in that goal. It was everything. But then we stopped. But then my mental health deteriorated even more. And even when I was at my worst, I was like asking the specialist, when am I going to get better? Because I want to go and do another round. It was, yeah, it's endless. And I think for a lot of couples, they don't stop and take that step back and think about, okay, what we're doing to ourselves. We stopped a few times and would say, okay, why are we actually doing this? Why do we want kids? And making sure it's something that we were both really wanting, and not doing it for some other reason or external or people. And that was that I think really at the core of what made us continue, but with the reflection that we need to take care of ourselves as well.
I don't think many people realise when you go for IVF and infertility treatment what it involves. You know, you just said there were operations, injections, tablets, medication, more operations. People don't realise it's what it involves. I think that's something I think perhaps needs to be spoken more of. You know, what is actually involved? You know, to your point there, Anita, and then the impact of all that on our mental health, because I don't think people realise the seriousness of going through those cycles of IVF. Sorry, Dawn, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay, Sylvia. I was just going to say, Anita, did you take your sort of company on that journey with you? Did they know where you were at with stuff? Because I guess that could have played out in the workplace, couldn't it? I guess people might have seen that you were, you know, acting differently, behaving differently because of what you were going through. Were they fully aware of that, and were they supportive at the time?
Yeah, so I was open with my manager from quite early on to say that I'm going for treatment, fertility treatment, and I'm going to be taking time off, and that was managed. So yeah, I was in the same company for all 3 rounds, so it kind of was a bit of a continuation. And I was lucky; they were understanding. They didn't put pressure on me. And I felt like I could do what I needed to do. I know everyone's not always that fortunate, but yeah, it just they were with it the whole way through.
Yeah, and that's really great to hear, isn't it? That, and I think, you know, we talk a lot about things like that on this conversation, don't we? And I think it does feel like we've moved into a different space where organisations are more supportive, but I guess there's still more education to do around it, isn't there? So yeah, no, that's good to hear, Anita.
Yeah, and just going back to what you're saying, Sylvia, about what's actually involved, it is very invasive. And after our first round was unsuccessful, we felt like someone had died, and we hadn't realised that we're going through grief until someone said it. It's grief, and we never expected to be feeling that way, and it's the grief, I think, has stayed with us the whole way through. So it would sometimes, it's, you know, like with most things, it's not really there. Some days it feels quite big, and I think that's really important to factor in, is if you're going on a journey like this, the feelings that you might be experiencing. Like I said before, it's the shame, it's the guilt, it's the grief, it's the anxiety, it's the low mood, it's the depression. There's so many things that will sit with you going through that journey. And I think it's just knowing, when is your end point? When is the point where you kind of decide, you take the control back and decide what you're going to do, what it means for you, because it could go on forever, honestly. And it's not just the physical impact, the mental impact, it's the financial impact as well, because it is a postcode lottery as to whether you get NHS IVF support or not. And it depends where you live. Some offer nothing, some areas you'll get 3 rounds, and it's everything in between. So it's really factoring in the impact it could have on you and your relationship. Couples sometimes last the journey and sometimes couples don't, and it really changes things.
But it sounds like you had a really open conversation around, what was the right thing to do for you two as a couple, based on, I guess, the impact it was having and how long you've been trying. Because I think, to your point, I've also known and been aware of people who have just tried and they've almost not given up until it has either broken the relationship up or massively affected them. So I think, that's again is really positive to hear that you were able to have that conversation.
Yeah, no, definitely. We try to be as open as possible. Because end of the day, like I said, it's both of us in the journey, and it's got to be the right thing for both of us. Otherwise, that's where the conflict starts to come in and things start to break down. So yeah, definitely important to keep open those channels of communication.
Having been through the whole process, Anita, although it does sound like you had a much better experience of the workplace than many, what should workplaces do more of in this space to help people like yourself through this journey, this process?
So I think the first thing that came to mind is maintaining that confidentiality, because if someone discloses, I mean, who needs to know that? And just really keeping that contained, because it's not something you particularly want to share. And supporting from a workload perspective. So understanding, okay, what's going to be happening when do you need time off? Is there some work that someone else can be picking up? Because if you're injecting, going for appointments, then doing extraction and then a transfer, you're going to be, obviously it's a lot of pressure, and you don't know what side effects you might get from the medication. So it's really thinking about how can you manage that workload, what can we take away, and I think if it's an organisation where you can be upfront and honest, talk about it in advance so that the preparation can be done. And I suppose the other side is the well-being side. So what support does the person need in creating a safe space for them to talk if they need to, signposting them in terms of what's available in the company, be it the EAP, so employee assistance program, where they can access to someone to talk to, or whatever that could look like. But as I mentioned before, fertility policy can really give that guidance for managers and also individuals, if they can have, even it's a few days leave to have to go have their treatments and everything, that can be really helpful. So yeah, I think just thinking about what, from a company perspective, what support can be given and creating that sort of safe space.
And is there, I'm just thinking about sort of conversations I have with my team, and fertility doesn't come up a lot, to be honest, but are there sort of organisations that I could steer them to, sort of a team lead, that could help and support? Because I think they're probably less known, aren't they? And it may come down to the fact that this is something we don't talk about a lot.
Yeah, so there's a company called Fertility Network UK, so they are the national charity around fertility. There's a lot of resources on there, and they also support in having conversations in the workplace. So they can actually, they can come in and advise you if you want to develop a policy. They'll come in and do talks within the organisation. So I would say they're really the one-stop shop in terms of guidance and resources.
Yeah, they sound good. Thank you.
Yeah, and then when I went for my journey, so 6 years ago, I'd signed up as a volunteer. I'm still one today, and it's amazing how many women and also men are out there, and they have support groups for men, different sort of groups. So they, for example, the LGBTQ. I set up the South Asian group, so they have different groups based on where you might be coming from culturally, or what your background is. So that's really great, and I think it really helps to connect with others going through similar experiences, and because you feel less alone. I think that's the thing that really came through, is feeling alone in that journey. But when you have others and you can bounce off ideas or share how you're feeling, when you hear pregnancy news, that's always a moment where it can bring up feelings. So having someone to talk to and bounce off, I think that really helps.
I think that's a great point around loneliness, because that's sort of popped up for me, when I wasn't conceiving, whether it's my fault, his fault, whoever, a feeling of being very alone. Who do you talk to about this? Where do you take your conversations about not conceiving? But also, where do you take those conversations when it starts to affect one's mental health? What's going on here? So I think that's a great point about that loneliness, and I think that comes across in so many different things. But that's when something's going not according to plan, can be a very lonely place. And where do we go? And if there was something like Fertility UK, if I'd been aware of that all those years ago, who'd have known things might be very different. But it's that knowing that there's somewhere to go and have those conversations, those ones that are a bit tricky, the ones that are a bit challenging. How does one articulate what one is feeling? What is one feeling? And how to express that to people who actually understand, and not just going to poo-poo it and go, oh, everyone goes through that from time to time. You'll be all right, or it'll be all right, you'll conceive one day. But what if I don't? What happens then? And I think it's a great point to have those conversations in a safe place.
Definitely. And I think the other thing to point out, which is and I know a lot of people do not find helpful, is if you're struggling to conceive and someone says, why don't you just adopt? Like, it's you can sort of have that switch in your brain where it's that transactional, where you have all those feelings, those hopes about having your own child, and it's not happening. I don't know if you've had some experience, but it's not helpful. Just be like, oh, why don't you just adopt?
It's that word just, isn't it? Just adopt. But as Dawn was saying earlier, when talking about someone adopting or even fostering, the hoops and the hurdles one has to go through. And how can, as you say, to your point, is just switch from we're not conceiving, oh, let's go and adopt. Where do you put all those emotions? Where do you put that while you're going in that process? Yeah. And I'm probably not without any malintention, but again, coming back to my point, understanding with compassion and empathy what one's asking. So I'll just do that. It's not that easy. Yeah. Especially when you're carrying all those emotions around not conceiving in the first place.
Yeah, and like you said, it comes a lot of the times from a good place. People want to help, want to fix, but sometimes it's just to sit back and say, what do you need to that person, and then they can say what they need. If they want to talk, or just talk about something completely different, then whatever's going to help them in that moment.
I think just quickly, I think that's a really good point though, Anita, because I think historically I was one of life's fixers, so I wanted to fix everybody else's problems, and I think it's taken me a long time to realize that actually sometimes all that person needs is you to just sit next to them and listen, especially with the topic we're talking about today. You can't fix it, you can't take those feelings away, but you can actually sit side by side and just listen and empathize and be there to support, which is sometimes all somebody wants, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone's got a different journey, and like you say, some people choose not to pursue being a parent, whereas some people go for treatment, whereas some people will just let it be, whatever happens or doesn't happen. So yeah, everyone's coming from a different place and needs different things. Yeah. So yeah, it's been a really, really good conversation. I think we've covered some really key points in terms of the gender differences, the feelings that you experience going through this journey, the choices that we make, and the impact that it has. But also, what does that mean in the workplace? What can you do to support yourself, and what can your workplace be doing to support you? But I suppose before we close, is any kind of closing remarks and thoughts that you've had through this conversation?
I think for me, it's just been really, so first of all, thank you for sharing, your story, Anita. I think it's really powerful to hear the journey you've been on. And I think, and I guess what I've realized is it's, there is more to IVF than I first thought, to be honest. So I've talked about the adoption process. To hear you go through what you've kind of gone through with the IVF process, I think is really helped me understand why maybe there is such a taboo about it and why people don't feel comfortable sharing. But I think the more conversations we can have like this and help to educate people is just a really positive step forward.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think I definitely echo those comments from Dawn. I think it's something that, whilst it is very private and a very intimate thing, it is also something that does need to be spoken about. Perhaps, sometimes not always the details, but for people to understand perhaps what someone else is going through. And I've said it before, a bit more compassion and understanding and kindness. That it's not just the mechanics of the IVF treatment, it's the wider impact on one's mental health, physiology, well-being in general. And that I think is something I think a lot more need to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And yeah, just for myself, it is just to reiterate, when someone visibly doesn't have kids, it's to not ask that question, and not, like you were saying, that can create that sense of awkwardness when you think that question's coming. And just appreciate that everyone's on a different journey and has, chooses not to have kids. But I think, the mental health aspect is really important to understand. Anyone that are going through that journey, asking them what they need, being there to support, and work however and whenever you can. But and I think for those who are going through that journey, just take care of yourself as much as possible. Put yourself at the centre and make sure you're not, having any negative impacts on things like mental health and physical health. But thank you both so much. And we hope you enjoy this In Conversation.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.